One of my favorite t-shirts when I was a kid was this faded black t-shirt with large white lettering that said "Question Authority." And you might imagine when I wore this to school, it didn't make me super popular with the principal or teachers, but it did really articulate a core value I was raised with. And that is not just to question authority, but to question everything. My parents were hippies, and they were invested in asking questions about the status quo and not accepting answers that were intended to pacify or mislead. They started an organic gardening commune in the 1970s, before anyone really knew what the word organic meant. They built our house mostly off the grid, and we had these giant solar panels on the roof and a windmill to generate electricity and an enormous vegetable garden where we grew most of our food to eat. And this way of life was definitely seen as radical by some, but the term radical hippie was not usually used as a compliment. It was used as a pejorative. It was a way to insult our family and mark us as different. But a funny thing happens when you're marked as different. You start to understand the fallibility of normal. You start to understand that what is radical is relational, that there is no radical without the mainstream, and both are just ideas based on mythology. You also recognize that hierarchies are usually created by those on the top who are pretty desperate to stay there. And once you start to see all of this clearly, you really have no choice but to question everything. So it's in this spirit of questioning that I really fell in love with craft. See, I see craft as radical. It's still largely considered within the context of fine art, and historically it has been seen as less than fine art. So there are many definitions of craft, and one of the simplest is objects made by hand from one of the 5 historic media. That is fiber, glass, clay, metal, or wood. But I really like an expanded definition that considers craft an approach to materials, that recognizes a long history of making that takes place outside of the museum walls and values function, plurality, and community. So I've really come to understand craft as being viewed as less than fine art, because fine art is still currently situated at the top of this material culture's hierarchy. And because of that, art history has largely been written to maintain that hierarchy and fit art history nicely into a colonial narrative that celebrates greed, exceptionalism, and individuality. As an undergraduate art student, I learned about art history as a parade of white male geniuses, creating singular works that shocked and scandalized viewers and eventually shifted the zeitgeist for everyone. I learned about many white European men and then many white American men. I learned about museums with marble facades and white walls. In graduate school, the scope of who we studied did broaden a little bit. So we studied female artists and non-white artists, artists from countries outside of Europe. But the orientation and the value system remained the same. All the artists we studied were aligned with the same mythology, drew from the same narrative of art history that valued genius, museum exhibitions, and high-priced auction sales as markers of success. Then finally, in one of my last semesters at graduate school, I was introduced to craft. We read Glenn Adamson's Thinking Through Craft and Alyssa Author's String Felt Thread. And I realized that there was this entire field of people interested in material culture who were asking different questions and centering different narratives with a very different idea of success. And also importantly, the field of craft considers objects created for domestic spaces. And this was really important to me as a feminist because most of women's lives are tethered to domestic spaces. So this spring, I was really honored to receive a grant from the Center for Craft to create a website called Craft Conscious. And the site was designed to support craft educators and students during COVID-caused distanced learning. So the site features video mini lectures, reading lists, makers lists, all that center feminist and anti-racist content. And it also approaches craft conceptually and attempts to really remove craft from this fine art hierarchy and instead use craft as a way to consider our material culture differently. So to give you an example, or many examples of what I mean, I want to leave you with 10 questions. 10 questions from the 10 organizing themes on the site, Craft Conscious, to really help us all start to think through material culture a little differently and ask different questions. So here we go. Capitalism. Who profits most from everyday objects in our home? Does the person responsible for creating the object, whose labor made it possible, have a sustainable life? Spirituality. How do the objects around us connect us to each other and to the natural world? Race. How has the history of racialized labor and forced free labor impacted how we value objects around us? Performance. How can some objects act as relics of a performance, evidence of a performative act? How does this impact our relationship with time? Embodiment. How do makers who make clothing, mugs, furniture, or other objects intended for embodied engagement consider the end user's body when creating? And how does that impact empathy? Nature. Where are the elements of the natural world most evident in our home? How do makers who need to connect to this natural environment care for and tend to the materials in order to create their best work? Gender. How does our conception of history shift when we consider objects in domestic spaces with as much thought and nuance as great works of art in marble-clad museums? Tradition. How does our relationship with the present change when we acknowledge the ever-present past? When we recognize rituals, family histories, and skills passed down from generation to generation as valuable? Care. When everyday objects have increased value, how do we care for them differently? How can mending, making, crafting contribute to self-care? And why is care so often belittled in mainstream contexts? And finally, community. When we acknowledge that most things are made by teams of people, how does this shift our view of singular genius and individuality? And when our neighbors are makers whose livelihoods depend on selling objects they've made, how does this change how we value objects? So these are just a few of the questions. I hope the site Craft Conscious will help us all think through. And I hope you'll join me there and really explore the radical potential of craft. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Good morning to the Creative Mornings community. I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit about some of the photos that you see before you. This picture you're looking at right now comes from a meeting in early 2017 of the Buncombe County Commissioners. I was present at that meeting and it was memorable to me for 3 reasons. First, it was the very first time that I'd been in the presence of the young people from Word on the Street. They were there sharing a video of interviews they had performed with local Black community leaders. You see, the commissioners on that evening were deciding on the fate of what became known as the Isaac Coleman Economic Community Investment Fund. It was an initiative to reinvest $1.5 million into Black communities that had been harmed through racist and systematic oppression over the years of Asheville's history. The commissioners approved that legislation unanimously, which I also remember, but what stood out the most to me was a comment by one of the young men from Word on the Street who told the commissioners, y'all just need to go ahead and make this money available to our communities. We know you got it from all the hotels that keep going up around the city. I really appreciated having the young people in the room and having their voice shared. And I think it had a lot to do with the response that the commissioners chose in opting to make that money available. You see, you're looking at a photo of Depot Street in what is now known as the River Arts District, but has always been a part of Asheville's South Side community, a historically Black neighborhood whose boundaries stretch from the French Broad River all the way to the borders of downtown Asheville. In the 1950s and around that time, many of these communities, particularly South Side, were extremely, extremely vibrant centers of Black life. And as a result of capitalism's practices of extraction and exploitation, you've seen communities like Southside where there were hundreds of homes, at one point 14 grocery stores, and dozens of Black-owned businesses ranging from barbershops and beauty salons to filling stations and mechanic stores. They're gone now. And that neighborhood is a food desert with one of the highest concentrations of public housing in the city and some of the most drastic social, health, and economic disparities in the state. You see, the $1.5 million that the county commissioners made available was a good start, but there's no way that $1.5 million over 3 years can even begin to touch the cause of harm that has been experienced in these Black and brown communities. Ultimately, it's not about how much money you have, but what you do with that money that matters. And communities need to heal from the trauma of urban violence and racial marginalization that exists in the post-civil rights era. Recognizing that there's a shared lived experience and a history of revolutionary solidarity between Black, brown, and indigenous people throughout the Afro-Latinx diaspora, a program called Word on the Street was founded in the summer of 2016 as an opportunity to create an online magazine for and from youth of color. This photo features the first cohort of young folks known as the Squad as they prepared for a weekend retreat where they went to establish their vision, mission, and a process for working together. Using art as a tool, these young folks from the Squad also, along with artists of color, worked to share their stories and voices in the language they felt most comfortable speaking. I joined the program in 2017 in its second year. And from the time I began there, I started noticing some of the challenges that we were encountering. One of the first challenges that we were facing was that we just didn't have real program space. We were sharing space in a community center. We were bouncing around from room to room. There was no place to consistently have our program. There was no place for us to store the work. We also didn't really have a set of best practices for how to put together and maintain a website consistently. We also didn't have the right tools. As you can see from this photo, one of the young people in the program is actually working on a laptop that was owned by one of the staff members. And those computers in the background really didn't have the horsepower, the software, the hardware necessary to do what we were really trying to make it do. We made it work for the best part, thanks to the resiliency of our ancestors and the efforts that we had to keep it going. But we were needing some support, and we were needing to make some changes. I think perhaps one of the biggest challenges we faced most of all was the fact that these young people didn't really have a concept and a connection to a magazine. Now, when I was younger, I remember having subscriptions to everything from Boys Life to Sports Illustrated. I remember magazines like Teen Beat and Right On and 16 and all sorts of things that myself and my peers would look forward to eagerly every month. In college, it was magazines like The Source and Vibe and Village Voice that kept me connected with my culture and the things that I was finding interesting. And for young people today, magazines and the websites, they just don't do it for them. So we had to regroup. We had to think about how could we connect to them in the ways that they were most connected with. And most importantly, if you talk to any of those young people, they would tell you that they came to the program not because of the magazine, but they came for the relationships and also for the stipends, for the money we provide as an incentive for their consistent participation. So in the beginning of this year, we decided to make some changes. And one of the first changes we made was to shift to a more youth-driven project model. And so what that looks like is we provide the young people in the squad with a prompt. We allow them to choose partners that they want to work with, and we allow them to choose the art forms that they want to use. They are then responsible for defining a vision for their project, what they want it to look like. They then come up with a plan to get that project completed. And the artist mentors and the staff work with them to see that through to fruition. This is all part of what Professor Psychologist Rick Snyder refers to as hope theory. And hope theory really defines an ability to set goals and transcend any obstacles to reach them. Hope theory has become a critical component of the work that we do with the squad in Word on the Street. Another thing that happened for us this year was in July, we solved our space issue when we moved into permanent space here at the Arthur Eddington Center in the Southside community. This is really important because Word on the Street is an intentional gathering of young people who, if it were not for this program, they would never be in the same place at the same time. They speak different languages. They come from different communities. They go to different schools. They're in different grades. But when they're here, they're home. And by having program space and office space that's dedicated to them, it reinforces their value in this community. And it says, you matter, you are loved, you are welcome, you belong. And so the young ladies in this photo here are working on tables that are in the room that they've designed. And thanks to the Craft Futures Fund, they were able to spend this summer working with some local artists and makers to design and create these tables that give the room their own personal flair. Another thing that we're doing with the youth from Word on the Street is what Dr. Sean Ginwright refers to as radical healing. And radical healing is the process of building hope, optimism, and vision to create justice in the midst of oppression. You see, we surround these young people with caring relationships. They are in caring relationships with each other. They're in caring relationships with the adults who support them in their work. We do items and we do activities that are intended to solidify their racial identity, to cultivate pride in who they are, in their lineage, in their ancestry, in their cultural significance, and why that is all important. We work with them to have a sense of social consciousness so that they know it's not just about them, it's about the community and about the village that supports and raises and loves and cherishes them. This radical healing is important because of the harm that's been done to these young people and their family members over years of oppressive practices, not just here in Asheville, but throughout the world that have been experienced by Black and Brown communities. You see, Charlene Carruthers, in her book, Unapologetic, talks about the Black radical tradition. And she said that it begins with the dreams of our ancestors, who were the first to fight against colonialism and what became the transatlantic slave trade. She talks further about the radical imagination, and more specifically, the Black radical imagination, and says that it is killed through gender-based violence, criminalization, and incarceration, poverty, and environmental degradation. These are all the environments and circumstances that these young people live in every day. You see, collective liberation requires a radical imagination. And the work that we do with them is inspired by 5 questions Charlene Carruthers put forth. Who am I? Who are my people? What do we want? What are we building? And are we ready to win? And the mural, this art piece that you're looking at this young man working on right now, is part of an artistic mural where the squad members are creating art in response to each of those 5 questions. And those murals are going to go on the walls behind me in this room here. I could speak for hours about Word on the Street and never come anywhere near saying everything that there is to say about it. It's a unique and bilingual, safe space for teens of color to recognize their power and build a better future for all. Testimonies like this from Serenity, who was one of our first squad members, I feel say a lot about the significance of this program and the work that we're doing with them. We are helping them to see where their power is and where their voice has significance and power in the community. And for young people like Serenity, she's not only been a valuable member of the program since it began, but she's taken this experience to start her own photography business and is a budding artist in her own right. And so in closing, I just say that capitalism is something that has taught us about competition and scarcity. But through the work that we've done, we've started to realize that there's power in recognizing and sharing abundance. That is a radical act. And we've even redefined our annual event as one opportunity to share our abundance with those that we are in community and invite them to share their abundance with us. So there's going to be a link in the chat and a very special video that's going to come in just a moment. But I just want to end with a statement from Charlene Carruthers, who says that being radical is a choice and it takes work. Thank you.